when Raymond Arroyo joins us. Every time he does, people enjoy the segment. They may want to go back and listen to it again. So you can do that on the podcast. He has his own, by the way, the Arroyo Grande podcast on iHeart. He is a New York Times bestselling author. You see him all the time on Fox News with good people like Laura Ingraham. And Ray also happens to be, in fact, when I talked with him for the very first time in person, it was at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Dallas this year, and he and I were talking about the Pope's failing health at the time, and he said that he would be covering it ultimately, and it sounds like he's going to be very, very shortly for Fox. He already has been. I think he's going to Rome, and he was good enough to join us on the phone this morning. Ray, thanks so much for your time. Good morning.
Oh, Chris, delighted to be with you under sad circumstances, but, this happens. It's part of the life and living nature of the church. A pope comes, a pope goes. It's the nature of the thing.
You said to me that you were fairly sure the end was near for him. I think he lived maybe a little longer than folks thought. J.D. Vance visited with him, I think maybe the morning he died. Yeah,
no, J.D. Vance was the last world leader, world official who, saw him. And, the Pope this is the the oldest man to ever occupy the papacy. He was 88 years old, so he wasn't a young, vigorous guy. He had been having terrible health problems for a long time. But, what happens, and this is my third conclave, Chris, that I've covered. You mentioned it earlier. I kind of, I'm like a battle-scarred, commander. They send you home, and then when the war breaks out, they draft you back into duty. So off I go again to the Vatican to cover another one of these. But it's, the difference is I knew John Paul II and Benedict personally. I mean, they were personal friends. I'd have dinner with them and lunches with them. I mean, I knew them intimately. I did not have that same relationship with Francis. He was a very different kind of pope, and certainly a rupture, a breakage from the continuity, the clarity of doctrine and belief that was articulated, I think, by the former two popes. So this is he represented, by his own words, he was bringing a revolution, not only to re-explore Catholic doctrine and teaching, but also, I think, in the process, rattled a lot of people because classic Christianity was suddenly up for grabs, and some of the models that he imported, the synodal model, which is, I don't know what that means, and neither does anyone else. But a synod,
sounds fun to say.
I know. Well, they call this his last big event was called the Synod on Synodality. That's like the listening session on listening. I mean, I don't, and that's basically what it was. It was a worldwide gathering that he called several times, where bishops, priests, lay people, atheists, non-believers, people from other faiths all came together and kind of had a confab to discuss Christian doctrine and whether it should be changed or not. Well, that's not a synod of bishops. That's a synod of everybody. And it's just not... Look, let me break this down, certainly for our non-Catholic listeners now. Why does the Pope matter? People say, why do we have to pay any attention to this guy in white running around? Well, here's why. Catholics believe, and history teaches us, there's a chain of men that run right back from Pope Francis to St. Peter the Apostle. Now, in between, there were a lot of, there were Borgia popes, there were a lot of lousy popes, and there were saints in the mix. It's the nature of humanity. The wonder of it is Christ entrusted with St. Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven. He said, what you bind on earth will be bound on earth, what you loose will be loosed in heaven as well. And that teaching authority, feed my sheep, tend my sheep, those imperatives are really what the Pope's marching orders are. But doctrinal clarity is really at the heart of why the Pope exists. And he's the central axis on which, in the human sense, Christianity is best articulated. And so when Pope Francis began to open up these questions and say, and he didn't change any doctrine, let's just say that. He didn't change doctrine. But around the edges, he tinkered or wanted to tinker. And that confused a lot of people. It was a papacy of confusion.
Yes, and I want to get into who now may come next, but while you brought up Raymond Arroyo, and again, by the way, RaymondArroyo.com for all of his coverage. I'm sure he's going to have plenty there, as well as the Arroyo Grande podcast. Make sure you get that and his coverage and his trip back to Rome again. You said you were personal friends with two previous popes, and I'm just curious, when you talked with these men or you had a meal with these men, the gravity of the job, if you want, I guess. I don't know. Does that get old? Does it become old hat? What do you think is the character of men who hold this position? They're not inerrant.
You, Chris,
they would say that themselves, right?
What I noticed is it was a cross for both of them in different ways. Imagine you are now responsible for. You're basically the pastor of 1 billion souls. I mean, imagine the weight of that. Okay, now people look to you to be the voice of the gospel. You know, Catholics believe this is the vicar of Christ. He's the successor of St. Peter. There's a reason that Pope Francis's body is lying feet away from the remains of Peter the Apostle, who's buried underneath St. Peter's Basilica. You know, they actually discovered the tombs. It's down there. There's actually another church. People don't realize this. When you go in the Vatican and see St. Peter's there's another church underneath, the Constantine Basilica, built in 316 or 315 A.D. That's still under there. They packed it with dirt and built the current St. Peter's atop it. And beneath that first Constantinian Basilica is an above-ground cemetery. It was at the time anyway, like you'd find in New Orleans. And there is the box, the little stone ossuary carrying the bones of St. Peter. I mean, they've confirmed this. There's a dig in the 50s, but I mean, I know that's a lot of background, but there's a profound link to that first apostle. And, you know, Jesus says to him, and I'm paraphrasing, but, you know, when you are older, men will, they will take you where you don't want to go. That's what Jesus says to Peter. And indeed, that's what happens to all of these popes. These are men. Benedict, I'll give you just the example of Benedict XVI, who was Joseph Ratzinger, a wonderful theologian, holy man, quiet man, liked to play his piano and write theology in the afternoon, prayed in the morning and went to work. And he wanted to retire. He planned on retiring when John Paul II died. And he was elected Pope. The cross of that. He's also a shy, retiring guy who suddenly now has to go before hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people via media every time he walks out of his front door.
Yikes.
So the cross of that, and I watched him assume that and embrace it. But it wasn't easy to him. It was foreign from him. To me, that's humility. Humility is putting on the job and putting on the vestments that you don't feel like putting on and reaching out to people when you're a very shy soul. That's humility. The kind of grandiose hugging the poor and, posing for pictures and all of that, the world thinks that's humility. No, humility is when you suffer when only God can see it. That's humility. And you do it quietly and you don't complain. And that's what I saw in John Paul II and Benedict in different ways.
That's profound, actually, Raymond Arroyo. Are you, and maybe you're not, I don't mean to infer this is what you're saying. Are you saying that you thought that perhaps Pope Francis was a bit more showy, for want of a better term? Well,
I'll say that. I think he was well-intentioned, but he wanted the world to know that he was shaking up the papacy and was going to make it something different. And he bought into the world's conception of the papacy, which is this is a grandiose, luxurious thing, vestiges of royal, lineage that we wear in our fancy garments. So he threw all that off. He ran around in black pants and, beat up shoes and would carry his own bag. But the truth is that became kind of a prop. And the biggest thing, this is a pet peeve of mine, early on, the big coverage, you'll see it all week. You're going to see this all week, so listen closely to this. That Pope Francis didn't want to live in the apostolic palace because he was so humble. He wanted to take a little apartment in something called the Santa Marta house. This is a house where all the cardinals will be during the conclave. Well, if you or I, Chris, were the Pope, we'd live in the Santa Marta house too. It was built in 1994. It's kind of a really nice hotel, okay, with a big queen-size bed and a marble tub in the private thing, and the air and heating works. Unlike the, quote, apostolic palace. John Paul II and Benedict lived in that palace, but the palace was a corner apartment with a single bed, literally, bookcases, and a desk where they would write. It was hardly glamorous, and I remember Benedict XVI shivering in the winter with a blanket over his shoulders when I went to see him, because it was drafty because it was the corner room. It's at the far corner of the top floor. So humility comes in many faces, is what I'd say.
That is a wonderful insight.
And I
have about a minute. Yeah, sorry.
Well, that's what. Look, it's like you get married and you have a family. Well, guess what? You got to go to work. You have to come home. You got to do the job. You can't say, I'm going to shake off those conventions. I'm going to live down the block. You handle the kids, honey, and just bring me my meals. I'm shaking up what it means to be a husband. You can't do that. And I hope the next Pope restores and embraces those traditions and the appearance of the Pope as well as the interior life.
And with a little less than a minute to go, Ray, about the next Pope, do you believe that you're going to see one return that is a little more, if you want, traditional or orthodox in the way you were speaking of Benedict or Pope
I think
John
there's
Paul?
rank confusion in the church today. I think people see the fallout for all the wonderful gestures of Pope Francis and the good side of him, going out to places and people that hadn't been touched by the church before. On the other hand, they see the confusion, they feel it. It reverberates through other communities, through evangelicals and the Episcopal, those who believe other things, and even our Jewish brothers and sisters. They feel the confusion and the lack of mooring. I think you'll get a Pope who I hope roots the faith again in the traditional teachings of Jesus Christ, articulates it in a vibrant way, and does so following and adhering to the traditions handed to us from the apostles. That's what the church is supposed to do. That's who the Pope is supposed to be.
Oh, imagine just standing on the Word of God. Wouldn't that be refreshing? And just leave it at that. Raymond Arroyo.
It ain't easy, but it works.
My friend, I am really grateful for your perspective. When do you head to Rome?
I'm going to Rome on Wednesday. I'll be there through the duration. At Arroyo Grande, I'll be doing daily updates, but I'll be on the Fox News channel at 3 a.m. Eastern Time tonight with Martha McCollum and a cast of thousands to cover the funeral of Pope Francis, and we'll get into much more of this.
We'll be watching and listening at the Arroyo Grande podcast. Raymond Arroyo, thank you, my friend, so much. I hope you have a beautiful weekend.
For full shows, live and on demand, it's Salem News Channel.